Hello everybody.
Hi.
My name's Richard Crook. I'm a local architect and I've been involved with various stages of restoration of the Eastbourne Winter Gardens. And I think that's what you're particularly interested in. But to set the scene, I'm also going to talk a bit about the Devonshire Park, because of course the Winter Garden is really part of the Devonshire Park. Without the Devonshire Park there would be no Winter Garden, and without the Winter Garden there would be no Devonshire Park. So let's make sure everybody can see, okay, but I'm going to stand about here. Okay, so far away, Nicholas, if you can put the first one up, that's me. And the area of the Devonshire Park, thank you, is shown on this map of 1817 by William Figg. William Figg was a surveyor in Lewes, and the interesting thing about the map is you can see immediately it's a load of fields. Eastbourne was a very late developer, unlike Brighton, as a seaside resort. And unlike Brighton, which sort of grew from villages, Eastbourne actually is the product of the development by one man, really, who owned this large country house, Compton Place. And he was the second Earl of Burlington, who became the 7th Duke of Devonshire in 1858. And it was the Earl of Burlington in the 1840s who decided he was going to develop his seaside resort, or seaside estate, of Compton Place, and he owned all this land here, into what he thought would be a seaside resort for gentlemen. So Eastbourne has always had this very snobby image. He's deliberately set out to produce a town for gentlemen, and it's been called a resort by a gentleman for gentlemen. So there you go. Anyway, that's Compton Place. Devonshire Park, where we are now, is just about here. There's the Wish Tower, which is down by the seafront. And so this map of 1817 shows that in 1817 there was nothing much here except the house, little hamlets of Southbourne, sea houses and meads. Thank you. This is a view of the stately home, Compton Place, which was remodelled by Colin Campbell in 1726. Thank you. And the first proposals of the Earl of Burlington was in 1837, when Decimus Burton, the London architect, was employed to survey and set out a new town called Eastbourne. You can see there the Earl of Burlington's estate at Eastbourne. That's the Wish Tower there, just to get your bearings, and we are in the area just about here. None of that was built except for the little church, thank you, which is Holy Trinity by Decimus Burton. And if any of you know Decimus Burton's work, he did the Palm House at Kew Gardens, the Hyde Park screen and the Marble Arch. He was a very important architect. So he had his beginnings in Eastbourne, but his main development was over in St Leonard's at Hastings. Thank you. And now we come on to why I wanted to set the scene. This, as you can see, is an amazing conservatory. It's of course the Palm House at Kew by Decimus Burton in 1844. This is a pre-runner of the Great Exhibition building by Joseph Paxton of 1851. But the principle's the same, a huge building of iron and glass, cast iron with sheet glass, and this building here was constructed when another architect was apprenticed to Decimus Burton. His name was Henry Curry, and it was Henry Curry who set out Eastbourne for the 7th Duke of Devonshire later on in 1859, just after Lord George Cavendish had given various parcels of land to the Duke, but the main benefactor was the bachelor Duke at Chatsworth House, who died childless, and the estate therefore went to his cousin, who was the 2nd Earl of Burlington. That's why the 2nd Earl of Burlington became the 7th Duke of Devonshire. All quite complicated, but you just need to know that as to why the Winter Garden came about. Okay. And then at Chatsworth, for the 6th Duke, we have this amazing building called the Great Stove. And this, once again, just predates the Crystal Palace. The Great Stove at Chatsworth is 1836, and this was designed by Decimus Burton working with Joseph Paxton. So we've got this building type established, which later was to give rise to our own Winter Garden. And the building type established was an industrial building built of a kit of parts with no wet trades, no cement except for the plinth and the foundations. So it's like a giant Meccano set. The scale of that is shown by a man here. You can see how enormous it was. And Queen Victoria visited Chatsworth and drove through the whole of this in a coach and four. Now this is the man who developed Eastbourne, the 7th Duke of Devonshire, one of the finest flowers of the Victorian nobility and indeed the wealthiest aristocrat in the country once he'd inherited Chatsworth House in 1838. He was Chancellor of London and Cambridge University, and this statue is at the top of Devonshire Place opposite the bandstand. You might have seen it. And he's wearing the clothes or robes of Chancellor as the Chancellor of Cambridge University. Thank you. The other man that you need to know about is, mentioned his name, Henry Curry, C-U-R-R-E-Y, not like the Vindaloo. Now he is an amazing man. He was Vice President of the Royal Institute of British Architects. His main work was St Thomas's Hospital, opposite the House of Parliament. But his father, Percival Curry, was the 6th Duke's legal advisor. And he became, his father and his brother then took on the mantle of the legal advisors and agents for the Dukes of Devonshire. And believe it or not, Curry and Company, the London firm of solicitors, is still in existence, and they still act for the present Duke of Devonshire. And this is quite important because it shows how important family relationships are with the landed gentry. These things carry on from generation to generation and are still going on today. Thank you. Henry Curry, once he'd been apprentice, worked on the Chiswick Conservatory, which is a rather bad picture of it, up in Chiswick House. Thank you. And he was also involved with Joseph Paxton on the development of the hot baths at Buxton for the 7th Duke of Devonshire. Paxton went on, of course, to create the Crystal Palace of 1851 for the Great Exhibition. Picture of it there, thank you. But coming back to Eastbourne, after the Earl had become the 7th Duke of Devonshire in 1858, he soon employed Curry, Henry Curry here, to lay out a portion of the property of His Grace the Duke of Devonshire for building purposes. Thank you. And this was the plan that was produced. You can probably see it upstairs as well. And what's interesting is there's no Devonshire Park at that time, because it was laid out as a building estate for the middle and upper classes. The idea was that the Duke would pay for the roads, the pavements and the boundary walls, the sewerage, the gas lights, all that, all the infrastructure would be paid for, and then he would let off individual building plots to speculative builders and then gain in the income. So that was how the project worked. In the early days it was going to be just a town, and there wasn't really any thought of amenities. Thank you. There was a local agent, George Ambrose Wallace, and this is him, who was introduced to the Duke by Henry Curry, and it was this man who became the first mayor. He also ran a building estate called Wallace and Wallace, and he was the local agent to the Duke of Devonshire. So quite a nice lucrative state of affairs. He could actually award himself the largest building contracts, and he could give himself permission as the chairman of the local board. That's how the Victorians worked. He was a self-made man, and he eventually built a huge house in Eastbourne, which unfortunately was demolished in the 60s. Thank you.
Not a very attractive one.
Then in 1872, the Duke, having started off on the building development, which was gathering apace, so that in the 1870s, Eastbourne was the largest, most rapidly expanding resort in Sussex. The population doubled to 25,000 in 5 years. And it was a huge building enterprise. But in 1872, Curry produced for the Duke a second plan. Thank you. The black blobs are what has already been built between 1859 and 1870 here. This is the projection of the estate moving westwards, high-class estate at the foot of the Downs, and Professor Cannadine of Cambridge University has done a study on the resort development. He thinks it's the most perfect example of how the Victorians planned an aristocratic seaside resort. They were perfectly placed with the undulating land, well drained on the foot of Beachy Head and the Downs, chalk, very nice. East end of town, marshlands, all the smoke from the chimneys here moving eastwards, definitely an east end, all the sewage flowing down to the east end as well. So you've got this wonderful zoning of the resort. The high class area here, and in the middle here, the town centre, the business district. But what's interesting, even on this map of 1872, Devonshire Park was still shown as building. And it was a year later, after a great success at Buxton Pavilion Gardens, that the Duke decided he needed to have a central entertainment area to attract the right sort of people to his resort. He'd already started that by founding a college, Eastbourne College, a public school for the sons of what he called gentlemen and nobility. So the idea was to create attractions that would attract the right sort of people to his resort. Okay. That's just a close-up showing the area that is now Devonshire Park, and the Winter Garden is about there. So we now get on to the Winter Garden itself. That's the first view of an Ordnance Survey map of the Devonshire Park. So what was going to be houses became the Devonshire Park. It started off life as a cricket ground, but soon developed as a tennis ground. It was one of the first tennis centres in the country after Wimbledon, just about the same time. And of course we still have the tradition of tennis here today with the, whatever you call it, tennis, the big tennis week that we have in Eastbourne. The baths are over here. This little building we're situated in, the Heritage Centre, is on the corner. So the baths were built as part of the Devonshire Park and Baths Company, founded by a local doctor, but soon taken up by the Duke of Devonshire, who realised he needed to pour money into it. The baths are an amazing Victorian masterpiece. They were the largest heated, I've got to get all these words right, saltwater indoor baths in the country when they were built. Massive swimming pool. The ladies' and gentlemen's baths kept separate. Well, you know, can't have ladies and gentlemen swimming together. So they were separated off, and you've got two large pools. The ladies' pool slightly smaller because of course they can't swim as fast as they. So it was all very well categorised sort of social status of the day. But the interesting about these baths, it was designed by Mr. Wallace, the mayor you saw earlier. He was an engineer. That there was a pipe that ran under the promenade, and so they could get rid of the old water just by opening a valve at low tide, and at high tide they opened the same valve, and then water could come in, so that there were no pumps. Brilliant bit of simple Victorian engineering. And in the baths tower here, that provided steam under a pipe, which later was to heat the winter gardens, which we're just about to talk about. Okay, and here we have an early photograph of the Grand Hotel being built. But what's interesting about this is, in the background here, the scaffolding and the start of the winter garden. The lower level floral hall has already been built. The upper level pavilion hasn't yet started. So just to put a date to all this, we have the lower level floral hall opened in 1875, which must be the date of this picture, near enough. And then a year later, the pavilion, or the gold room as it's sometimes called, on the upper level of 1876. And I think I've got a little quote somewhere about that. I'm fine, don't worry. Basically, the first mention of the proposed winter garden was in the Duke's diary of 1874. Perhaps we'll look at the next slide, it's a bit prettier. There's the Baths Tower. Here's our row of shops, and there's the Heritage Centre. Thank you, Nicholas. Just to show you a bit more about the baths. Here is a section through the baths, the ladies' pool and the gentlemen's pool. Thank you. And there is how the whole thing works with the winter garden on the other side of the road here. Thank you. Right. So, the Duke of Devonshire's diary. Duke of Devonshire said, I had a long talk with Curry, that was the architect, and his brother, about Eastbourne matters, chiefly about putting up a building of the same kind as the pavilion in the Buxton Gardens. And so that was the first mention of it. And then the local paper said, from time to time we have made our readers acquainted with this project, that being the new pavilion and skating rink. Mr. Henry Curry is the architect of His Grace the Duke of Devonshire, and from the early drawings it appears that the building will measure each way 150 feet and the height to the summit of the central vane 85 feet. It contains a large winter garden and skating rink, 150 foot by 50 foot, laid with an asphalt floor. The glass is by Pilkingtons. There is a refreshment room and 4 billiard rooms. The foundations are of Portland cement, and basically the whole work is to be entrusted to Mr. James Hayward, the contractor, for £12,000. So this is the Winter Garden. Now these people here aren't just walking around, they're actually skating. You just see their wheels. And the whole project, the lower level floral hall, was opened as a skating rink by the inventor of the roller skate, an American called Mr. Plimpton. And until fairly recently, roller skates were called Plimpton skates. I don't know if anybody's heard of that. But anyway, he came over and opened up the skating rink. They had a German band. Thank you. Next. Oh, sorry. That just shows the similarity between the roof shapes of our winter garden to the farmhouse at Kew. Inside, there was a little minstrel's gallery where a German band, Herwolf's band, used to play. And here they are skating around inside the floral hall, which had a glass roof. There were strips of glass, as you can see, and it was very much like the farmhouse at Kew. And so when you go around and have a look in Devonshire Park, you'll see it. It doesn't look quite like it used to. It's been extended many times, and the front of the Winter Garden is really rather a disgrace, put on in the 1950s. So it doesn't look like this now. But if you look up at the roof, you can get an idea of this filigree iron building. And that's a view from the park, looking back towards the Winter Gardens. What's interesting about this whole area is, as we are here, we're sunk down here on this building to the original level of the ground. All the streets all around us were built up with chalk taken from the Western Parade's extension. So all the roads here are artificially built up, which is why in the Devonshire Park Theatre you come in at the circle level and you have to then drop down into the stalls. So the Devonshire Park is at the natural original ground level, and this pavilion makes use of the rise up to the built up streets all the way around. Cool. Photograph. We haven't got good photographs of the interior, but this shows how the whole of the floral hall was created to be a garden that can be used in the winter, a true winter garden. Thank you. This is an early view of the upper level pavilion, and you can see how basic the structure was. It's all the structural elements are on show. Now it's covered up by Edwardian later decoration with plasterwork, but these are the cast iron columns. There is a Fletcher and Loud's tubular glazing system was used for the roof. This is timber matchboarding, and then you've got these areas of glass as well. And this is laid out for a concert. Elgar used to come to Eastbourne. Eastbourne had 3 orchestras in its heyday. One of them, which was a symphony orchestra called the Eastbourne Symphony Orchestra, which was earlier than Bournemouth, and unfortunately it was disbanded. So there was a Duke of Devonshire's orchestra, and one of the musicians of the Duke of Devonshire orchestra was Wesley Woodyard, who was the cellist who went down with the Titanic, and there's a memorial to Wesley Woodward that you can see on the lower level of the bandstand. So he went down with the Titanic. Thank you. And then there were marvellous tea gardens and dances, and this is a typical sort of select Eastbourne society having tea outside the floral hall on a glorious August day in about 1890. And you can see the conservatory-like appearance of the building, the French doors open, and the nannies and everybody all strutting about having a very nice polite tea party. Thank you. Some modern illustrations of how the Winter Garden could look like if it was restored, and this is the hope that it will be. It's now a listed building, and the Winter Garden is a very rare building type. Buxton Pavilion is one survivor, but there aren't many more. There are later Winter Gardens, but a true Victorian Winter Garden could put Eastbourne perhaps on the map. Brighton has its wonderful pavilion. Thank you. But Eastbourne has this iconic Winter Garden building, which I think could very much put Eastbourne on the map. This is the side elevation with the two main elements here, and the front elevation here. Quite interesting, it's on an 11-foot grid, except for this bit here, which was a drive-through for carriages originally, which was stretched to 15 foot. Okay. The rear elevation, as it originally was from the park, there's now a big Edwardian stage that's been added on the back, which rather spoiled it. But that's the Minstrel's Gallery, and here is the rear elevation. Thank you. And the front elevation looks very different now. Originally, it was that high. After only 2 years, they decided to bolt on some cast iron columns to form this first floor tea room. And so that was, this bit is actually an addition to the original. Okay. Details now of various elements. This is the roof decoration, the frieze and ironwork, all cast in Scotland and brought down and bolted on. Thank you.
We have examples in there.
Is that the end?
No.
Oh, well done. And then at each end of the roof is a vane, these decorative vanes which are added on there. This is part of the refurbishment of the roofs, which I was involved in a few years ago. Thank you. And going back to the park, there was the Devonshire Park Cycle Academy for ladies. Here they are, coming around here. This little gazebo was a feature that was originally taken up to a building exhibition in London and then brought back to Eastbourne. Unfortunately that's gone, but this is the rear view of the Devonshire Park Theatre there. Thank you. There's a little view of the miniature temple by Mr. Hookham. Thank you. There in fact is Wesley Woodward, who went down with the Titanic, that man there. And this is the band at the end of the upper level pavilion. And you can see the cast iron columns and then just very simple stencil decoration into the structure. So it's a very elegant and light building. If you go inside now, it's all covered up with Edwardian fat plaster columns with big capitals, which are interesting in their own right, but it's not the sort of pure engineering building that it originally was. Thank you. There's Wesley Wood, not a bad photograph of the other one, and there's Wesley Woodward's signature for those of you interested in that. Okay. And then we had various later buildings at Eastbourne, Devonshire Park. This is the Devonshire Park Theatre by Henry Curry. The Winter Garden was by Henry Curry. The layout of Eastbourne is by Henry Curry. Just about everything in Eastbourne is by Henry Curry. But this is the Devonshire Park Theatre by Curry. But this was remodelled internally by the famous architect Frank Matcham. And so the inside is very much Matcham's theatre. And that's the end of the lecture, really. This is a view from the foot of Beachy Head, looking east towards the rapidly expanding resort of Eastbourne in about 1876. And there is the Winter Gardens in the middle, just before the Meads area was developed. So I hope that's been of interest, and thank you for listening.